Great. We can get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Andrea Armeni. I'm the Executive Director of Transform Finance and the convener of the Transform Finance Investor Network. I'm very excited to have you all joining us today for this webinar in our ongoing series on empowering stakeholders to verify impact via new technology. And we'll be learning about the work of this great organization, Sela, the learning journey that they've been on, and some of the framing that our longstanding friends, Joanna and Jess Rimington have been doing on different methodologies and an increase for stakeholder engagement. I will turn it over to my colleague, Kurt Lyon, the Associate Director of Programs here at Transform Finance, to change things up a little bit. After over 50 webinars, you're probably tired of just hearing the introduction from me. So bring you some fresh voices as we expand the team. And I very much look forward to the various presentations and to the discussion. So thank you again for joining us. Over to you, Kurt.
Thanks, Andrea, and I'll speak for the folks on the line. I'm sure no one is tired of hearing your presentations, and we're all, grateful for the work that you've done so far with these webinars. So yeah, I'll kick it right off and introduce some of the speakers that we have today. We're really thrilled to have this great set of speakers speaking from different perspectives on this Project Sela and some of the research behind it. So Joanna and Jess Rimington from the Global Project Center at Stanford University are going to talk a little bit about their research and how the community-driven processes in impact verification and accountability actually drive some of the impact itself. We're then going to hear from Chi Nadi at Sela, founder and CEO, hear a little bit more about what this platform is, how it operates, where it came from, and what their plans are going forward. And then afterwards, we're going to cap it off with Lila Rothenburg at Development Capital Strategies and Cynthia Jaggi at Living Economy Holdings, who will talk a little bit about the co-learning process that was behind Sela and that really was fundamental to its formation and the baked-in accountability and community engagement that Sela has from the beginning. So before we get into it, some quick updates from Transform Finance and the Transform Finance Investor Network. We're really thrilled to welcome Emily Sledek as a project researcher for our Capital and Equitable Communities project. We've talked about this project a few times before and in passing, and we're really kicking it off. We're looking at the ways in which that capital, broadly speaking, can engage with communities in driving certain outcomes that make some communities more equitable and some a little less so. So looking at how structures such as community roundtables for place-based investors, community-controlled capital, deep engagement with community stakeholders from the philanthropic and financial intermediary side of things can actually drive outcomes in the communities that are receiving the capital. So looking at that broad set in a year-long research project, Emily is going to be leading that. If you're interested in hearing more about that, please reach out to us at the end of the webinar. We'd be happy to go into it a little bit more. And for the Investor Network, we wanted to lift up again the New Hampshire Community Loan Fund and their raise that they are currently undergoing. A few of you were on a call that we did a few months ago, and basically for those who weren't on the call, they're trying to set up a conversion through an investment for a community of families on a plot of land with manufactured homes. And essentially, the conversion deal is to set up a resident-owned community where the communities themselves actually own the land that their houses are on. And this is in the face of rising consolidation with private equity of manufactured home communities and how those communities that have been bought out are being displaced. So this is actually a very impactful way to preserve those families and their homes and the values of their communities. So if you'd like to learn more about that opportunity, we have a recording of that webinar conversation on our website, or feel free to reach out to us and we can connect you to people and give you some more information. Our next webinar is going to be on June 12th with the Global Infrastructure Basel Foundation, talking about best practices for infrastructure development. So how to involve the right stakeholders, what those metrics look like, and they've had their own methodology that they've implemented, and we'll be sharing a little bit more about on the Investor Network webinar in June. Lastly, if you have any topics that you'd like to see covered by the Investor Network webinars, we are totally open to ideas and suggestions and connections that would lift up some voices in the finance space and in the social justice space that would be of interest to the participants that we convene on these. So with that, let's get to today's topic, which is really all about accountability and who defines it, how it gets verified, and what the accountability actually means. Looking at processes versus products, which is kind of a theme with a lot of our webinars and a lot of Transform Finance's work. Does the process of democratizing the way that metrics are defined and that impact is measured and held accountable actually drive impact itself? And Sela is a really, really interesting example that kind of stands in relation to other metrics and methodologies out there and being very community-driven. And so a question that we want to keep in mind throughout this webinar is, what is the actual impact of the processes of having the community driving the impact metrics and the process of the evaluation and measurement? We've talked about this in various ways from different angles on past webinars over the year. Those of you way back may remember our webinar with Grupo Yansa, which has a community due diligence process that really engages communities in a way that allows them to participate in the due diligence itself for renewable energy projects, and how that actually can serve as a de-risking measure for investors, providing benefits for the investors while also retaining value in the community, which is a very innovative method for those large-scale renewable energy projects. We also, earlier this year, had a conversation with Navajo Power, which was developing renewables again, but this time on the land of Native communities in partnership with those communities, discussing how that process and that dialogue can actually help retain some of the economic benefits of those projects within the communities that are currently relying on extractive coal industries in that just transition framework, doing some really interesting community partnerships out there in the West. And lastly, we also talked earlier this year with Accountability Council on how to take accountability mechanisms that were previously applied for more traditional foreign direct investments and apply them to private investments that did not have as structured of a process of impact accountability. And it's important to note that it's still addressing what is going wrong with some of those investments. So, how to rectify some past wrongs rather than being an upfront, baked-in approach. And that's some of the distinctions that we're going to tease out during this presentation, hopefully. So those of you who have been on Transform Finance Investor Network webinars before have likely seen the 3 principles of transformative finance listed here. And this one is really about this first principle, which is deep engagement of affected community in design, governance, and ownership. So we really want to lift up those practices that are taking the community's values and priorities seriously and baking them into the actual product itself. And Sela is a really excellent example of what that looks like in practice. and we'll hear from all sides on how that was actually undertaken. And we think that when the community's values are translated properly into the investment process, that actually can help drive the second two principles of being non-extractive and fairly allocating the risks and returns of the investments across all the stakeholders, because the communities know what priorities and what is a proper risk bearing and risk tolerance for them as stakeholders, and they'll be able to speak up and hold investors accountable to the different situations that each of those stakeholders are resting in. So some themes to keep in mind during the rest of the presentation is that we're really looking at the democratization of that community accountability. So how investors can go deep onto community engagement. So in that first principle is really what we want to get across to this audience today, because that's really one of the driving impact theses behind products like Sela. And it's interesting to compare Sela to some of the other metrics and methodologies that exist out there, some of which are a little bit more top-down. They're kind of pie in the sky, North Star guiding principles, whereas Sela is really embodying some of those designs that are driven by the needs of communities. Again, focusing on the process rather than the product, which is a tech platform itself, being really the key driver of the impact in this case. And we want to also lift up the need for investors to support those kinds of companies, especially in the tech industry where there's a lot of attention to platforms and fintech that's receiving some more traditional venture capital attention, and how there really is a need for such really impact and community-driven platforms to have aligned investors that have aligned capital, and having partners on the investor side that are really willing to support these processes and not just view them as the next big tech platform out there. So I wanted to lift that up to our audience today. Just to go back to the agenda, Jess and Joanna are going to talk about their research findings on accountability. She will go ahead and talk about Sela after that and answer some questions about the platform. And then Cynthia and Delilah will reflect on their experiences on the co-learning team in the implementation of the Sela platform. And at the end, we'll have a Q&A. Please feel free to send, using the chat functions, questions to Transform Finance, or feel free to pose it also to the group using the everyone identifier in the chat box. And with that, I will pass it on to Jess and Joanna at the Global Project Center at Stanford University. Joanna is a long-term Transform Finance collaborator, and we're really, really happy to have her on board today. She's worked with us on the Buen Vivir project and has appeared on several other webinars. And Jess has been working closely with Joanna, and they have been doing some excellent research together at Stanford, and we're quite excited to hear from them. So with that, I will pass the ball over to Joanna, and you can take it away.
All right. Thank you very much, Kurt. Thank you, Transform Finance. Can everyone hear? Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today. As Kurt mentioned, what we're talking about today is the issue of who defines impact and who gets to define and decide what development will do and how that will be measured. And next slide here, please. There we go. Okay. Today, we're going to hear about how the challenge of generating meaningful, verified information around impact, how that can be a big challenge with high costs and tedious pain points for different kinds of investors. And those challenges are really important ones that our sector needs to address and get better at. But before we go into some of those specifics, I just want to take a moment to ground us here in what is at stake with this issue, and what is at stake when projects are not accountable. And I'm going to share some of this in light of, as co-researcher with Jess for the past 5 years on issues related to bringing stakeholders into coming up with solutions, and also sharing with my hat on as a board member of International Accountability Project. So in terms of what is at stake when projects are not accountable, project finance flowing around the globe, I mean, as many of us here on the call today know, that is one of the major drivers of human rights violations and environmental destruction. So if we just look at one issue alone that comes out of mismanaged big projects, is the issue of development forced eviction, when entire communities are forced to uproot to make way for projects being imposed. Excuse me. And these are often projects that local people do not want and had zero say in. Development driving this kind of uprooting is actually the single biggest driver of forced migration globally. Some World Bank studies in recent years have put the number at 12 million people per year uprooted. And it's not just that folks are uprooted, it is that often the vast majority of them are uprooted without compensation or due process, having lost the source of their livelihood. And so you can imagine the results are pretty devastating and have the opposite effect of what development should have. So just to remind us of what is at stake in the bigger picture and why it is such an imperative that the sector get better at making projects actually create impact that is meaningful and verified with the people whom these projects are supposed to benefit. And I'll just say briefly, the photos that I'm sharing here are from a project launched by International Accountability Project and partners called the Early Warning System. And I'll chat in the link in case anyone is interested. And just to say briefly before Jess and I move into talking about some of the points from our research around this, none of us on the call today, I'm assuming, are involved in the kind of funding the kind of big projects that tend to pop up on the early warning system, like the massive open pit coal mine you saw on the first page. So it might feel like, what does this issue of accountability have to do with me? But as Transform Finance has explored in previous webinars, even projects that are much smaller scale and projects that are have the best of intentions, that even those smaller, very well-intentioned impact projects can still sometimes have unintended consequences that cause harm. So for all of us, it is important to think about how we can build in measures to create accountability to project stakeholders for what happens. So before Jess and I talk about our research as it relates to innovation, I just want to ground us in accountability here as our baseline. And that baseline of do no harm. It's fantastic when stakeholder engagement can go beyond basic participation and enter the realm of co-creation, as we'll talk about. But an intention to do co-creation does not ever replace or negate the need for basic steps and systems to create accountability to the people impacted. And all projects and all finance that are trying to achieve development and impact goals have a responsibility to understand what local people want in terms of development aims and priorities, and to engage them in shaping project plans and then in verifying whether those occur, and ensuring that folks on the ground have access to channels to flag concerns if something's going off track. So that's easier said than done. As we all know, there's challenges around making that happen, but this is our baseline around how accountability is the foundation. And then the exciting piece of what is possible when there is accountability as a foundation is that engagement with stakeholders can go beyond just ensuring do no harm and can go into the realm of unlock possibility and to help projects completely reimagine what they otherwise would do and be and create. When a project taps insights and wisdom from many, many people and stakeholders, that is how impact projects become transformative. The research that Jess and I have been leading since 2015 is showing that co-creation with multi-stakeholder groups is a very powerful way to unlock this kind of possibility. When groups of people involved in a project decide together to go beyond do no harm and to make the effort to bring everyone to the table to co-create what the impact is that is actually most needed and what is the wisest way to get there, it turns out it can be very powerful. And with that, I'm going to hand to Jess to share a little bit more about our research and what that has to do with Sela and the co-learning team initiative of Sela.
Thank you, Joanna, and thank you, Transform Finance, for the opportunity to speak with you all today. So yeah, we want to share with you briefly about how the kind of collaboration that Joanna is speaking to and the kind of collaboration that Sela has been taking part in, that's really also been the heart and soul of the company from its start, how this type of co-creation is now being shown by research to be a powerful way to make impact smarter and more transformative. So over the last decade, there's been this explosion of interest in collaboration and open innovation and crowd engagement. A lot of companies are moving away from a model in which products and services are being created through, these closed-door, top-down, expert-biased processes towards more open, crowdsourced, and user-driven strategies. Nonprofits, social entrepreneurs, community groups are also embracing co-creation as a response to the challenge of tackling pressing problems in an increasingly complex world. And our research has been focused on exploring what happens when funders are also involved in co-creation, and when the question of how a solution will be financed is part of what gets co-created. And we're used to a world, right, in which funding decisions, funding terms, or practices are determined by only a few in back rooms. But it turns out that when we question our assumptions about how funding should work, and we're willing to start with a blank slate and invite many people around the table to co-create together, that this can often be the critical piece that drives a new initiative to dramatically outperform what peer efforts are achieving in the same space. So it can be the lever, really, that gets pulled for optimized impact. So in our role as visiting scholars with the Global Project Center, we've been leading a multidisciplinary research process that started back in 2015, where we've been identifying a method for multi-stakeholder co-creation that's linked to superior results in tackling complex problems. And our research began with examining more than 70 diverse entities enacting co-creation processes, and these ranged from nonprofits to small and large companies to social movements, impact funds. And from that, we conducted a participatory analysis with 20 of those groups whose co-creative efforts were leading to the most outstanding results in their sector. And the particular kind of superior result we identified is the phenomena that we've termed breakout innovation. And we define breakout innovation as groups that do three things. So first, they create designs powerfully aligned with the needs and possibilities of the system they are addressing. So in other words, the solutions they come up with are perceived as visionary and transformative. They really move the dial in a big way. The second is that they deliver solutions that make a rapid leap from concept to real-world implementation and wide uptake. So the solutions get implemented and embraced at scale quickly. And the third is that they generate a shift in power dynamics that activate more innovators within their system, permanently changing the dynamics so that a far greater number of actors now play creative leadership roles. So in other words, many stakeholders can keep innovating on the solution to continue to make it even better. And what we found is that the actors delivering those breakout results, that they co-created in ways that represent a pretty significant rupture from mainstream practice within their field. And we spent about a year looking into what are the patterns and similarities across the way in which they work. And we're able to see that pretty strikingly, there's a lot of similarities, and they really can be identified as 5 practices that are consistent across this broad diversity of breakout actors and cases. And passing to Joanna to give us some examples and talk through those 5 practices.
Thank you, Jess. So what are those 5 practices? Turns out they're powerful, but also fairly fundamental, basic. The first practice is what we call share power. So this is more than just engaging people for their opinions. It's actually sharing power with them to make the decisions, to be creative partners, and to implement those decisions. So one example of this is the group resident-led architecture firm called Concordia, based in New Orleans, following Hurricane Katrina over a decade ago, after several failed attempts at coming up with urban revitalization and recovery plan that different sections around the city could agree to. Concordia was brought in with an alternative approach and engaged over 9,000 residents in the city, and including folks who are in diaspora, to create a plan together and to flesh out and ratify components of it by neighborhood. And the plan was overwhelmingly accepted and embraced, and happened on a lower budget and in a quicker timeline than the other plans. So that's the power of sharing power. The second practice that we see across the board is prioritize relationships. So this is what happens in co-creative processes when people are not engaged in a very transactive way of I'm just talking to you to get the answer I need and I leave, but instead really creating space to build relationships with people that are bigger than the project or the task at hand. One example was a collaborative research initiative by the University of California and San Francisco Hospital, their heart cardiology department. In heart disease research, the initiatives that get funded for research often end up having very little real-world impact in patients' quality of life, and UCSF led an initiative to change that and created a patient-powered network of patients, doctors, and researchers working together. And because often a barrier in those groups really talking is different power dynamic issues among them, that process spent a lot of time really creating real connection and relationship among people before they started innovating together. And it led to multiple projects that got national funding and had very relevant results for patient quality of life. And that project happened several years ago, and we've still heard that when doctors or patients are driving through each other's town, they call one another to stop by for dinner and hang out, and those relationships have continued to bear fruit and new ideas. Seek difference. This is another very vital practice of the groups who are doing co-creation in ways that lead to the kind of breakout innovation that Jess spoke to. So this means bringing very different life experiences and perspectives around the table. It's way more than a token effort at diversity. It's people who really understand and value the importance of profoundly different experiences. One example of this practice is an initiative called 10 Squared, that is a program that multinational corporations hire to address really intractable supply chain and worker health and safety problems in their factories. And what this program consistently does is problems that have just not been solved for years get tackled by a team of high-level managers and frontline factory workers who each bring their kinds of knowledge and perspective around the table. And that program has designed and implemented solutions within 100 days. They do this intensive work together thanks to those different perspectives. Fourth practice is what we call using all ways of knowing, or legitimizing all kinds of knowledge. And this is practices that do a good job of setting up a container where different kinds of knowledge and experience are equally valued. So not just technical knowledge or information from formal academic training, but really lifting up people's lived experiences, their memories of what happened before, even stories that have been passed down from prior generations, and engaging people in intuitive and even kind of body moving ways that help us get to new insights and new kind of thinking. That's a really powerful way to get to breakthrough ideas. And last but not least is prototype early and often, or test solutions early and often, a concept I'm sure a lot of us are familiar with from the lean approach. But this is making sure that projects' ideas are rolled out and tested with folks co-creatively. So that Concordia case from New Orleans I mentioned at the beginning, one of the ways they progressed so rapidly was after every round of community engagement and feedback, coming back with, all right, here's what we're hearing, and here's what we think, here's what we propose happens. Where did we get this wrong? What do y'all think? And that process not only sharpened the ideas very quickly, but it built trust that deepened people's engagement, because folks feel like, wow, this is a process that I'm not just being asked to share my ideas and nothing happened. They already turned my ideas into action. So those are 5 practices that we see consistently across co-creation that leads to really transformative results. I'm going to pass back to Jess to just share a little bit about the specific co-creative initiative that Sela is leading right now, and then we'll hear from Sela themselves.
Thanks, Joanna. So if you want to read more about the 5 practices, we can see if a link can be sent out to an article that summarizes the work with more cases that came out in a 2017 SSIR article. But for now, we want to start talking about the work we've been doing with Sela, and we've been honored to be asked by Sela to facilitate a co-creative process with their staff and with a group of 18 investment and philanthropic practitioners. A really remarkable group, some of them are on this call, of people bringing very diverse experiences to the table, from investment in blockchain to philanthropy for human rights work, and many more. And Sela has brought together these 18 people with their staff to form the Sela co-learning team. And everyone is volunteering their time and advising and expertise for a 4-month process, working together to co-creatively generate a set of strategic recommendations for Sela. And through this process, the 5 practices you saw have been an embedded component, so we can try to set up Sela for a set of recommendations and insights that can help achieve that breakout innovation around accountability that we're talking about. So the 2 questions we've been focusing recommendations on are, first, how should Sela finance itself? Specifically, what path should Sela follow in its own financing over the coming 3 to 5 years? So that means the types, the sources, the phasing of capital for Sela to optimize its ability to achieve its desired positive change that you'll hear more about from their CEO, Chi, shortly. And the second question is, what products should Sela build? Specifically, what kinds of user experience features should Sela build for capital providers using their portal and platform? So obviously have a lot of detailed and past research and existing development around the overall product, and really working with the co-learning team to figure out the specific user experience that might be relatable to even some of them as future clients as well as others, so that the user experience reinforces Sela's positive impact and value. So the team members have been working together in a process that started in March and concludes next month in June. We've had interviews, small group brainstorm sessions, learning and analysis as a full group, lots of reading and contributing to documents together, and some quality time together on Zoom calls virtually, as well as an in-person trip that this photo is taken from with Sela's staff in Lagos, Nigeria, and in communities in the Niger Delta that are the origin and inspiration for Sela's work. We're getting well along the way to generating some very powerful, we think, and surprising and thoughtful recommendations as a proposal to help guide Sela on a wise path forward, hopefully towards the transformative impact we all seek. So we're going to be handing over now to Sela founder and CEO, Chi Nadi. And just a quick note to say that when Joanna and I first connected with Chi through our research, we were really inspired to know more about this impact startup that has embraced a spirit of co-creation from its very start in all kinds of ways. And she will share with you about how Sela's portal and platform makes projects collaborative. And speaking of that practice of seeking difference, Sela provides tools and a process that brings together two parties who are usually very distant from one another when it comes to impact projects or the development of projects, capital providers for the project, and the community members whom the project most contributes to. And the fact that Sela is investing the time and effort and resources to go through this co-learning team process also shows how Sela embraces this multi-stakeholder collaboration and its behind-the-scenes work too. So every single one of us in this project, myself and Joanna included, is definitely learning a ton as the name co-learning team, and it feels like all of us, for all of us, the learning is not only impacting Sela's next steps, but I think that we're also taking away impressions and insights that will continue to influence our work and approach to funding more broadly. So as Kurt mentioned, we'll get to hear about this from two of our co-learning team members on this call, Cynthia Yagi and Delilah Rothenburg, who will be sharing after Chi. But with that, let's go ahead and hear about Sela itself, and Chi, handing to you.
Thank you very much, Jess. Everybody can hear me? Okay, that's great. That's great. And let's see. It's my first time presenting using this. There we go. No? Am I on the wrong slide? Oh, there we go. Okay, Sela. Our tagline is where humanity meets technology. And this comes from my experience working in the Niger Delta over the last, since 2013, full-time. And really just seeing how the changes in technologies were just changing people's lives and empowering local people and giving them a far more agency. And I'll get into an example of that later on. But let's first start in by diving into Sela. The problem. Creating real impact in Africa requires transparency, trust, and communication. And what we're seeing is that growth is being held back because of a lack of transparency, a lack of accountability. And to give you guys a perfect example of this, the Niger Delta, where I'm from, we've had, if anybody remembers the Exxon Valdez oil spill, we've had the equivalent of that every single year for the last 50 years. On top of each other, compounding, and it's never ever been cleaned. And this is just an example of a gross level of lack of accountability. So we are seeking to solve this at Sela. And how? Through ecosystem change. Sela is a digital tool that improves how capital enters and is deployed in Africa. So what that means concretely is we are seeking to create ecosystem change by creating real-time project management and impact measurement, by connecting all of the stakeholders together, in one platform Through the Sela portal, you're able to initiate your project, and in the process of initiation, communicate with local stakeholders and even set new impact metrics based on your communication and the design of the project. And if you're seeking to manage your project based on already set impact metrics, we've codified ESG GRI standards so that you'll be able to execute your project as the project is being executed, you're following those standards. But by creating this line of instant communication, you're now collaborating with your stakeholders on ground before and during the execution of the project. And the goal of all of this, because now you have this direct line of communication, is to then allow that stakeholder on ground to then create their own project and present more projects to the world. Essentially, the goal of Sela is to create more social entrepreneurs. How do we do this? Well, what we're doing is by bringing all of the stakeholders together, by bringing the communication together with all the different stakeholders, by triangulating data from the contractor on ground or the project developer on ground, the funder, and the local community, triangulating all that data as each milestone is being hit. You're making sure that your project is being tracked and executed on time and has local buy-in at the same time. Now, of course, this is coming from a high level of intimacy, specifically thinking about the Niger Delta, where projects don't get executed because they don't have local buy-in. Of course, the market is huge. When we're looking at development capital, impact investment, we're starting first in Nigeria, where the project was incepted, and really the thought was, how do we solve this problem that's right here in front of us? Now, if you think about our process, because from the beginning, it's about building from the ground up, building from the community up. We're not only seeking to measure impact, but also verify the project is taking place, and at the same time, bring all the stakeholders together. It's something that you can only do if you're coming from the perspective of the community going up to the funder. And as I was mentioning early on an earlier call, it's great to now be interacting with funders and really starting to understand them as well as we understand the civil societies and local communities. Now, this is our initial project in the Niger Delta, where we have found and selected 20 ponds. We've worked with local farmers, selected 20 fish farms that are currently being powered by Sela. What that means is the project is being initiated, managed, verified with the local community, and then measured all through the platform. And this would be the first large-scale cleanup ever in the Niger Delta since oil spill started in 1970. Now, when we talk about humanity meeting technology, by using blockchain, by using computer vision to analyze satellite and drone data to confirm activity on ground, and by using mobile technology to get insight from the community as well, essentially what you're doing is you're bringing economic empowerment to local actors on ground. Because now you know that when the community is submitting information, and when the person tells the truth, that person is now developing an economic identity. The problem that we saw in Nigeria is that there is no way of developing your own level of economic identity or economic agency. If you're someone in a local community, what value that you have to present is your local knowledge of, is the project actually taking place? And so we marry that local knowledge with technology to confirm and empower that local person that they are telling the truth, and then get them on that path towards economic empowerment. This goes through kind of our timeline that we've been on. We initially started way back in the end of 2017 in the Niger Delta doing human-centered design. We worked with Consensus, which is a well-known blockchain venture studio. What that meant was going and performing 100 interviews with local women in the market to really understand how they would even engage with this type of technology before we even started building anything. We executed oil spill cleanups, understanding the entire workflow before we started to understand where at different points we'd be inputting technology. really making sure that we understood the process and understood the people before we even started building the tech. And this is our team. This is our leadership team. Diversity is a strength for us, across gender, across age, and it's a combination of this leadership team and a strong advisory team with leaders in the space and impact and technology and coming from different directions. And it's that collaboration of the different points of view that we believe is the secret sauce to actually bringing together the Sela platform. And that's all for our presentation. Open up for questions from anybody. I'm sure you guys have plenty of questions.
And if there are no questions in line, now we will have like a dedicated Q&A session after Delilah and Cynthia's presentation. So you can either send them in via the chat, or we'll unmute folks on the phone and dialing in on the computer during that session. So if there are no questions now, we can move to Delilah and Cynthia. Okay.
Thanks, Kurt. Should I take over the slides?
Yeah, I'm passing to you now, and feel free to take it away.
Okay. All right. So hi, everybody. Lila Rothenburg with Development Capital Strategies. I am a member of the Sela co-learning team, and I think the experience that I'm bringing and the perspectives that I'm coming from are largely from a project developer, and I've also been involved on the lending side and the financing side of project development. So really, this has been through an ESG and impact investing lens. I've worked with these infrastructure developers and financiers on trying to engage communities, making sure that we have the right policies and procedures and practices in place to implement the IFC performance standards, the EHS guidelines, and so forth. So I'm going to share a bit about my experiences. I hope that they're helpful to you in thinking through how Sela might be helpful in your own investments or your own donor or grantee work. And happy to answer any questions at the end as well. So this first slide really summarizes some of the highlights that I have found with the Sela tool. So first of all, Sela centralizes data. In project development, I have a lot of different sources of information. Some information is in Word documents, some is in Excel, some is in an old file, some is in a new file. Sela aggregates all of that together and keeps it in a centralized place. The data is also easily standardized. So if you're going to the field and you're sending an enumerator to take, with pen and paper, pencil and paper, what somebody's income is, is it in Naira, the Nigerian currency? Is it in dollars? Is it monthly? Is it annual? The data can be easily and immediately entered into the Sela tool in a standardized way. You're not comparing apples and oranges. The data can also be cross-referenced from multiple sources and analyzed. So currently in the environment and the technology we currently have, we can get data from multiple different sources, but it's not easily aggregated, it's not easily analyzed, and the Sela tool can help with that in a more efficient way. You can also source data, as we've heard, through inclusive and direct collection with community members, with workers, providing people on the ground with an opportunity to be heard and seen by funders. And this has been a real challenge for a lot of us in the past. As somebody who sits frequently out of New York working on projects in sub-Saharan Africa, I don't always know and I don't always get access to what are the local people seeing and experiencing and what are their perspectives on the ground. And as you'll see in some following slides, the current practices of going through consultants or individual channels really filters out a lot of the information that could be useful to us in really understanding the project. So that goes into the next point in the turquoise or greenish box. I'm adding layers of accountability and a reality check in terms of positive and negative impacts of project activity. And then also the tool is really differentiated, and that it provides embedded support for local business ecosystem development that isn't just tangential CSR. So if I'm developing, not by myself, but with a team, a solar project or a wind project, and we say to the local community, yeah, you know, you've been farming on this land or your cattle's been grazing on this land, but, you know, we're gonna build a local community center for you. That's a tangential CSR activity, whereas these people can actually participate, as has been mentioned earlier, in the project design and giving feedback. They're paid for it. They can grow small businesses that are really part of the supply chain and ecosystem. And that just sort of leads into the last point on this slide, which is sort of twofold. One is from the project developer and financier perspective, lender or equity investor, it helps, the Sela tool can help avoid leakage and corruption. So it tracks dollars throughout the project, it tracks how they're used. And also, the Sela tool enables more efficiently and with more accountability local stakeholder investment into projects if the developers and the financiers so choose. So if we're looking at a solar project where the developers say, oh, we want to give the community an opportunity to participate and invest, the Sela tool, the Sela team are working on integrating aspects of this technology that will help facilitate and manage that. Okay, so concrete example of how Sela might help me in my work, and you might think about a parallel situation in your own work. If you're, and by the way, I know Sela talks a lot about this tool being very useful in Nigeria, in sub-Saharan Africa. It can be useful anywhere where you're not on the ground and where you really want to understand what's happening with your project. So if you're not there locally, you might hire some local consultants to help you get information, right? So before you start, let's just go with the example of a solar project. You're going to hire local consultants to help you collect baseline data, both social and environmental. So you have an environmental and social impact assessment. Currently, it's very difficult to find a good local consultant. There's just a very inefficient referral network. You might go to the Ministry of Environment, ask them for their list of registered consultants and pick from that. You might ask other local developers in the area. But the practice generally favors very well-connected business people, and it's not necessarily based on quality. When you introduce Sela, there's an opportunity for underrepresented people to compete for jobs and work. And then the Sela rating system also allows developers to really understand how accurate the local consultants are, what their reputations are, what their track record is, et cetera. Also, as an international project developer, we frequently hire international consulting firms to oversee the local consultants and do the quality assurance and quality control. Still, I mean, if we're hiring a local international consultancy based out of London, there's going to be limits as to what they can really verify on the ground. So it's much better to, and I don't really like using the word empower anymore, so I'm going to stop myself from using that word. It's much better to just put the Sela tool in the hands of local people and ask them to help verify what's actually going on the ground through videos, through photos, through surveys. You can also complement that, and as Chi said, triangulate that data, cross-reference it with satellite imagery, sensors. Chi has taught me that the blockchain word for that is Oracle, for those of you who don't know. Some extra co-learning for you was for me. And the tool helps bring that all together and helps you analyze and cross-reference that. So it really adds efficiencies to this kind of work, whether you continue to choose to work with an international consultant or not. Also, I noticed that the next webinar Transform Finance is doing is on best practices in stakeholder engagement and infrastructure. So I think this is particularly relevant, and I would be interested in how those presenters think about this tool if they watch this webinar. But stakeholder identification is really important when you start a project. So how do you identify the right stakeholders? Currently, you'll have iterative meetings with stakeholders to identify other stakeholders and discuss the project. So you'll talk to local elected officials, you'll talk to chiefs, you'll ask them, okay, who are the right people to engage? You might have a town hall meeting. You might not reach the right people in sending invites to the town hall meeting. So local power dynamics might prevent underrepresented people from being identified, even if you're a project developer with the best intentions and try your hardest. With a Sela tool, you can have an iterative process in a safe space where the initially identified stakeholders can then see who else has been identified and help verify what other stakeholders might not have been reached. And they can do this in a safe and direct manner. So they're not asked to speak up in a public or group meeting. They can just do it directly. And the Sela tool has opportunities to anonymize input from users so that nobody gets in trouble for doing that. In terms of stakeholder engagement and commitments, similarly, local power dynamics might make it difficult for you to hear feedback or grievances from underserved or underrepresented people. So, there might be minority ethnic groups, there might be women who don't have a voice, or youth, or the landless, and you might just be engaging directly with the landowners. So if you can in the first step, get the underrepresented people to actually be on the tool, then they have an opportunity to interact with you directly and share their perspectives and feedback. Just a personal example with this was I was working on a project where the project developer was engaging with a local chief, and the local chief said, look, you can take this part of our land if you build a local community center for us. And that was fine with the chief, but it actually, when we dug in deeper, was not okay with the rest of the community. So it's important for us to have those feedback mechanisms to reach people who might not have a voice through these local power dynamics. And then lastly on this slide, stakeholder socioeconomic data. So when you do an infrastructure project and maybe some others on the call who do other types of projects do something similar, you want to get sort of baseline data of what's the current situation, what's the socioeconomic data, what's the health data. And so you might send enumerators to the field to collect all this data, but again, the data might not be standardized. It's difficult to use, it's difficult to aggregate and analyze. The Sela tool makes this a lot easier and also helps you combine it with the stakeholder engagement data. You want to know that the local enumerators didn't just go to the broader community to do the socioeconomic survey. You want to know that the people who were using the land that you're developing on were actually reached out to, and that you understand what the impacts are going to be from the project on those people. So I think we're running out of time, but I'm not going to go through all of the bullet points on the left-hand side of the slide, but you can see that there's a lot of information that you need to collect in order to really understand if you've adequately engaged stakeholders. Just as an example, you might have a town hall meeting, and you need to know, and it needs to be documented somewhere, when were the invites sent? Were they sent far enough in advance? Was the meeting held in a location where people could go? What information was shared? Was it enough information about the project? Was it shared in a manner that people could easily understand if they're illiterate? Were there people who should have been at the meeting who weren't at the meeting? Were there grievances that weren't documented in the minutes? Were the people who actually attended the meeting actually project-affected people, or were they just random people who the local team were able to reach out to? So this is all important to understand. The Sela tool helps to bring all of this together in a standardized, centralized, and aggregated way. Right now, a lot of that data is kept in separate Word documents, Excel files, different folders, different versions, and it's just really difficult to sort out what's what, and to bring it all together in a clear picture. The last example I'll give is on implementation of policies and procedures. So again, this is somewhat relevant to infrastructure. Hopefully you can think of examples in your own work that are relevant as well. But in our work, we need to know that health, safety, and environmental inspections are being done, that's being done on equipment, construction equipment, or on infrastructure equipment that might be used in operations, the proper use of personal protective equipment, that the personal protective equipment is actually there, that's in good condition. We can have local teams take timestamp photos that can be uploaded directly into the platform. Again, standardized data fields, clarity on who submitted the data. Same thing with trainings. Your local team can say, oh yeah, we did a training. So you want to know all this information that's on the slide for people who can't see the slides. What was the date, time, and length and location of the training? Who attended? Who conducted the training? What was the content? Did participants understand the content? Grievances, near-miss incidents, and incidents. You can get immediate reporting. Witnesses can directly report what was seen. Recommendations can be made to avoid future incidents. Information from incident reporting forms can be automatically logged, and AI can help analyze data for future prevention of incidents. And then lastly, with environmental impacts is just another example. You can have local people verify whether, for instance, deforestation is taking place, whether their farms were cut down for a local ag project, what's the air, water, and soil quality. And again, that can be triangulated with satellite imagery and sensors, so you can really understand what's going on with your project. In terms of opportunities to engage, co-learn, and co-create, I wanted to share with you some of my ideas. You might have some of your own. How can Sela help you in your investments and grantee work? Something to think about. How can it help you track data, enhance your positive impacts, avoid negative impacts, and engage stakeholders? You can provide feedback to Sela as they develop the platform. You can help them design the platform through testing the tool and aspects of your work and fine-tuning or adjusting it along the way. That's something that I've been thinking about exploring with my project developer colleagues. You can participate in the Ogoni Land Pilot Project to clean up the ponds that she mentioned. And importantly, Transform Finance has done incredible work around alternative financing models to preserve impact and attract mission-aligned patient capital. And so as Sela grows in these early stages, what can we do to support them to think through alternative financing structures that helps them really preserve these incredible opportunities to enhance impact and give local project-affected people a voice. So I'm sure they'll welcome your input, and thanks.
Thank you, Delilah, and I'll pass it over to Cynthia, another member of the Sela co-learning team, to continue the conversation. Cynthia, you should have the slide capabilities now. So.
Okay, fantastic. Hi, everyone. Cynthia Yagi from Living Economy Holdings, and like Delilah, I'm a member of the co-learning team. We heard from Chi some of the benefits of the Sela platform and how it works, and Delilah spoke to some of the critical ways that Sela can support both project development and finance. I'm going to speak briefly, and given the time, quite briefly, to the value of participating in the co-learning team and the process itself. And then if people have questions, we can certainly go deeper in the discussion time. We're happy to follow up offline. There's two main reflections that I wanted to speak to that for me are critical pieces of the value of participating in this process and with this team, and that I hope can also be relevant to you as you consider your approach and engagement in projects. The first is vulnerability. I love this quote. Vulnerability is the birthplace of innovation, creativity, and change. That's from the researcher Brene Brown, who, if you don't know her work, I highly recommend investigating it. And so we're really always looking for places to be vulnerable and open to ourselves and new change possibilities that are in safe and constructive context. And that's not actually necessarily easy to find those places where we can really work in innovative ways together and show up with our full self. But I think that the process that Sela, in partnership with Jess and Joanna, created really allowed us all to show up, be seen, be vulnerable, and learn. And I really believe that that will lead to breakout outcomes, as we heard from Jess and Joanna, for Sela and for the work that they're doing. So we see this as actually part of also de-risking investments, both directly in the project, but also understanding how to participate in that kind of process, because that itself is a kind of learning. And one of the reasons that it is such a learning is because being vulnerable actually allows us to work and learn across a multitude of perspectives and contexts that we're not regularly working with or within. Industry, region, culture, generation, these were all kinds of context differences that the co-learning team members brought together. In some cases, radically different, very, very different kinds of experiential backgrounds that I think brought a vibrancy to the exchanges and in very specific ways, new ideas and new possibilities that wouldn't have been there if we didn't have that kind of sort of multi-level diversity of perspective and experience. So again, it speaks to this idea of seeking difference that also came out of the research. So actually looking to put together a group, and Sela really being able to curate a team that brought such a diversity of backgrounds, I think was key to being able to forward the platform and the company overall. And I also say that an important side benefit of that was the relationships that we all grew together. So especially, I think it was very challenging because there was what we call the virtual track that didn't get to go to Nigeria. And then there were those of us that were actually able to be in Nigeria, and that added a whole other layer of relational context. But on top of that, we actually managed to then reintegrate with the virtual track and create relationships across different kinds of place and time and space. So I think that's a very unusual happening and holds a lot of promise in other contexts as well. Okay, and the final piece that I want to speak to in terms of vulnerability is how being vulnerable is actually part of a systems and relational approach, because it starts to address power imbalances and inequity that have contributed to the collective challenges. So this is incredibly important topic that I know we've all on this call thought a lot about, but I think it's often hard to fully cognize how much we have to let ourselves be under the spotlight, as it were, and what that really means. So that this was really a way of showing up and working together that didn't only have the potential to lead to better outcomes, but the approach itself, actually participating in this kind of process itself, starts to shift some of those power dynamics and lets us sort of think through on a very practical basis the questions of risk and reward and what everyone is showing up with and bringing to the table, and then how that translates into the actual functioning of the Sela platform. And we talked a lot about that in terms of, in particular, how Sela will finance itself, and also how all kinds of stakeholders, very much including capital providers, will actually be able to participate in the platform. What kinds of structures are we actually embedding in the technology or in the platform and how it works that relate to this question of power and risk, reward, return. So I think those are incredibly important areas that the process itself helps us to highlight. So finally, I want to speak to reflections on how being part of the co-learning team has helped make visible the complexity and intractability of the context in which Sela is working. And I think that makes it particularly powerful, the work that they've already been able to do in the case studies and some of the potentials, for example, that Lila was speaking to for them to work. To give some specifics, it's estimated that there's over 12,000 development projects valued around $50 billion that are unfinished today in Nigeria. And I know she had spoken to this when we were there several times. It's quite striking when you think about the scale of projects that haven't gotten finished. And I think for all of us in the co-learning team, as we started hearing those kinds of things, inevitably just why? How can this be that all of these resources have flown in and we haven't gotten the kinds of results that even the projects aim for or that we would wish for? And obviously that's an incredibly complex question, but I think being there and participating in the co-learning team, working with the Sela team, we started to see some of the multi-layered parts of the picture that have led to the challenges. And I really feel strongly that it's only through that kind of deep, almost sensory experience of all of the layers of challenge, and also the opportunity, and things like the fact that Nigeria has an incredible cell phone service. So even in the most remote regions, it was possible to have the verifiers taking pictures and uploading those. So there's a lot of layers here. It's not that it's all negative, but it's complex. How do we leverage the pieces that are available to leverage to navigate this complexity? And I think that that sensed experience actually helps us be able to inform Sela's work, highlight how difficult it is and how much value they're adding, and also think about those layers of complexity that may or may not be as evident in other projects we're involved in. So for all of this work, I think there's multiple levels of participation in the program and team where we're able to both see how we can better support Sela, learn ourselves, more about ourselves and our role as partners and investors, and also be able to transfer those learnings as we think about other projects we're engaged in. So with that, I'll turn it back to Transform Finance. I know there's some questions coming in here, and let us kick off the discussion.
Great, thank you both. Really appreciate that presentation and providing a little bit more context into the kind of the theory around what we're talking about here with Sela. And I think that, for me at least, that leads very naturally into this Q&A from the audience, because I think a lot of the questions coming in are really relevant for what you all are talking about. And then Chi and others can talk a little bit more about some of the specifics with this particular case study in these series. So there are a few questions that came in, mostly for Chi. From Chet, I see we have a question on how Sela ensures independence of its own monitoring and evaluation of its own programs to avoid self-validation. And another question that just came in privately that I think is quite relevant to that question is how stakeholders, community stakeholders, are incentivized for the validation or monitoring process. So how to engage the communities and bring in those non-funder, non-project implementer partners in order to get that community verification. So Chi, feel free to answer those how you want.
I'll start with the community verification piece. One of the big insights for me in my journey in the Niger Delta was really realizing that many of the civil society actors that are the defenders of the community, local nonprofits, they were already doing many of these actions as a way of a first line of defense. But what wasn't being created was a way for them to be part of the economic transaction. And you know, it's the whole idea of it'll be difficult to get the civil society, like a local community nonprofit, and the project developer and the funder all in the same room. And so that's what got us really realizing that, okay, well, using blockchain, we can now connect this local community service organization that's already doing this action into the actual project as it's taking place. And so, and in so doing, there's just two ways to think about how the how the monitor can be paid. One, it could be part of the budget. I mean, for me, I've always been looking at specifically the Niger Delta issue and thinking, I mean, hundreds of millions of dollars are just disappearing. If you could just take a percentage of that and direct that to the local community, the local nonprofit that's already there, trying to bring accountability at the community level, the project would actually get executed. So that's one way that it'd be part of the budget. Another way to think about it, and this is again one of the benefits of building a platform using distributive ledgers, is that a philanthropist or that is interested specifically in, let's say, human rights or stakeholder engagement could fund that type of activity. So what you're essentially creating is an opportunity for blended finance. If it's an investment in, let's say, a school being built, but then there's a grant towards monitoring. Or it's the same way of thinking about if there's an investment towards a school being built and there's a capacity building program for teachers. But what we're seeking to do is create the tool to allow all of these actors to collaborate. Again, coming back from how do you get everybody in the same room? Oh, wait, you can't, but we can all get them to collaborate digitally. I think there was a second question.
There was a question on the cost implementation for Sela.
Cost of implementation. So we're at this stage, because I think it was an earlier question on how do projects get on Sela if they're designed and such, or they're pre-designed, or if it's basically, I guess the core of the question is the platform open or closed right now? And initially, what we're choosing to do is actually have the platform in what's called private beta, which means we're pre-selecting the projects. And in doing so, the reason why we're doing that is, one, because of all of the different types of value that we're adding at the new type of business model, we're still developing the pricing strategy. And more important, well, pricing obviously is important, but more important than that for us is really the R&D. Because at the end goal of this, because for me, it always comes back down to a friend of mine who was the leader of a local community nonprofit, and there's literally one person. How do you empower him, and what does he truly want? And for him, it's not only about accountability, but it's about economic empowerment. So as we are in private beta and we have pre-selected projects that we're executing in a sandbox in the Niger Delta, and then later on in future sandboxes, in multiple sandboxes, we're doing a lot of R&D to really build out the product, and more specifically, build out the different vectors of analyzing reputation, because we see this as an opportunity to be able to define reputation credibility on vectors more than just financial activity. Vectors as in how you're collaborating with other folks in the community, and how well you're working to support a project. And so that's, so to speak about costs of execution, at this point, it's really about making sure we bring the right partners, the right projects to collaborate with, so that we can actually learn and develop the product that we envision.
Thank you, Chi. And another question on the partner angle from the investor side came in over chat from Megan. I'm curious to understand the type of capital the Learning Lab thinks is appropriate for Sela over the next few years. What types of factors are driving these strategy recommendations around fundraising?
Did I take this one? Okay, since I've...
She wanted to give you, if you want to jump in, then we can fill in from there with our insights, but would love to hear from you first.
Yeah, no, it's been great, because this is, this speaks to the recommendations that we have, or the learnings actually that we've received and got through this process. And we got a very, strong recommendation to really focus on philanthropy and grant capital, so that we can really work to build the product that we envision. It's almost like if we focus more primarily on venture capital, there's a chance, there's a risk actually that in my mind, it's like you're cutting corners on your vision, and so especially thinking about how do we how do we create a product that not only brings collaboration with funders and communities, but also empowers communities? And how do we bring in financing that gives us a flexibility to go deep into certain areas and glean insights in building the product that you normally would not get if your only goal was to just build, let's say, 50% of the product and just scale throughout the entire world. There's a great opportunity here with the suite of technologies we're bringing together and our approach that allows us to go deep and create a product that will be really impactful for the space. And so right now we're specifically looking at, we've been recommended to partner with grant makers, philanthropists, and mission-aligned impact investors, so that we can make sure that all of our collaborators that we'll be working with are rowing with us in the same direction. And we're looking to bring together $3 million this year to be able to execute this vision over the next 18 months.
Great. I wonder, not to put you on the spot, but Cynthia and Delilah, as investor advisors in the co-learning team, if you all have anything to add there.
I mean, I'd just say that in terms of to share a little bit about the process and the back end, it's easy to sort of tell us, okay, this is the final direction, but I think the overarching sense is the need to be extremely thoughtful about from whichever kind of capital, who are the partners specifically, and does their approach and perspective align with Sela's aims, and also to think about that in a staged way and look at blended capital options that would really give them the most options in the long run. So really keeping in mind that long-term picture of what they're building and how much flexibility they want in terms of ownership and control and ability to direct towards impact and not have perspectives that might be conflicting with that, or even on the philanthropic side, make sure that they're aligning with capital that has the same kind of ideas about what impact means in the Sela context as they do.
Great. Thanks, everyone. That was, I think, clarifying, and I think a topic that a lot of the folks on the line wanted to discuss. So I'm glad we got to touch on that a little bit. Another question that came in via chat was around Joanna and Jess's presentation on those 5 principles that they laid out. So specifically, how they can be used in a community in a context where there is little trust. And I think the other presenters will probably be able to speak a little bit to this too. And that ties in directly to a project that Transform Finance is working on right now in post-conflict Colombia, looking at community-driven investment processes and what actually is the priorities of the communities in those specific contexts where there is post-conflict displacement. A lot of industries were completely wiped out or stopped functioning, and land was lost for a lot of those local entrepreneurs and farmers. So in post-conflict and zero trust environments like that, how can those principles be implemented?
Yeah, no, thank you. That's a really important question. I'm glad that's being brought up. I would say that generally, from our experience doing co-creation processes, you are starting at a trust deficit because we exist within a paradigm that does not encode within its values democratic decision-making and process at whatever level and type of project engagement. So that's particularly intense and the case often when what you're co-creating is around public good or questions of public good as it relates to private development, and where there's been a lot of broken trust and violence even in the past. We could do a whole webinar on this topic, but I'll share 3 kind of quick things that we've noticed in terms of ways this method and these 5 practices can, in some ways, help heal some of those trust deficits and reify what's possible. So I think one of those, even though it's very logistical, is prototype early and often. So part of that is about being really explicit and repeating back what's been heard very faithfully. So within co-creation, there's this role of the synthesizer, of a kind of facilitatory team that's expanding the question, who's engaged, the participation, and then getting it to some sort of point of synthesis. We talk about sometimes doing things with my hands, for those not on video, as a sideways hourglass. You expand, you synthesize, you faithfully try to do justice to what the feedback has been and the inputs for the insights, and then you repeat back and say, hey, did I get it right? Did we get this right? What are we coming towards? How are we refining? And then you synthesize again. Most co-creation efforts are actually not co-creation, they're consultation efforts, where what happens is you cast the net wide potentially, or you don't, and then you take in the feedback, and then you go cook something up in a closed door room, and people see some sort of master plan or something in 2 years, whether they're informed or not of it having happened. In this process, one of the ways to rebuild trust is by repeating back both what exactly was heard and allowing community input and edit on that, and before it's taken as fact, and then at the same time creating, here's what we heard and here's what we think we might want to do with this information as a collective, and here's a prototype of a suggestion of what we've done with that information. What do you think? Let's have this process happen again. I know that sounds very simple, but that continual iterative process of it's almost like a sacred role of synthesizing can just do a huge amount in rebuilding trust and also really affect the integrity of a project. More to say, but I'll stop there so there's time for more questions.
Great, thanks, Jess. So Andrea just posed a question that came in via chat around the governance over Sela, and we also got a request from Vivina to speak about the growth path for Sela. So I'll let the presenters respond to that question in the chat, and then we'll turn over to Vivina to talk about Sela's growth.
Sorry, I'm just my head was shaking because I'm trying to understand the question of element of shared governance.
Am I unmuted now? Hello?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay, sorry. Thank you. I just wanted to very quickly add to the excellent answer that she gave about the funding of the learning stage, because I think it is very important to mention that Sela is already very close to a number of potential funders and projects that could really catapult Sela onto the next stage. And it is important that these first projects and funders and potential funder clients actually understand what Sela is trying to do and help Sela achieve it, both in terms of technical tools as well as in funding contribution. And I just hope that Sela will be able to give us some positive news on that front imminently, and that will really change the dynamics for Sela's growth. And I will leave it at that.
Thank you, Vina. And Chi, to clarify the question that came in earlier, I think what the question was about is whether or not the community members have any kind of say over how Sela is like administered, which communities it goes into. Is there some kind of buy-in, like almost like a multi-stakeholder cooperative kind of thing, or is the community engagement really on the usage and participation and the impact verification and metric process?
Okay. I think I'm trying to figure out a way of answering the question without going too into like blockchain land, basically. That's what I'm trying to avoid. What we envision is that, and this is the reason why we want to do the learning stage in such a way, is that we envision an ability for the community to co-own specific projects that are taking place in their communities. And what that means is they're receiving economic benefit from it that they can then decide how, using Sela, how that economic benefit would be used to create public goods in their community. So that's one piece. And then the second piece is, I don't want to go too deep into blockchain, but as a platform that's built on distributed ledgers, there is a potential as the technology matures to get to a place where Sela itself is organized in a decentralized manner. But again, that's really, and I don't want to just get too much into the technology piece, but that's also why it's important for us to be very careful how we build in the initial stages, so that those type of future opportunities are there.
Thank you. I think that's a helpful answer to the question. I think it goes to the importance of having those early aligned partners who would allow that kind of like foundational building that really incorporates those community-centered characteristics. A follow-up question that I'm receiving to that one is whether the economic benefit goes directly to community members, or do they have any governance over Sela itself, or is it the way I'm understanding from your response, the governance is really around the specific projects rather than the Sela platform, whereby the stakeholders are engaging over a particular project, and there's the multi-stakeholder monitoring and facilitation.
Sorry, I think, okay, so I think one thing was talking about governance over specific projects, but also governance over, and then, sorry, to answer the first part of the question, which was, are they receiving the economic benefit themselves? And so that's the answer is yes. From the beginning, because that's the problem you see on ground, is that the economic benefit does not go directly to the community member. It gets lost in all the different levels of hierarchy. So that's the answer to that is yes. Governance over the platform itself, that again speaks to that you can only get to that place when, because there's two levels. There's governance over the activities that are taking place, and then governance on the platform itself is really talking about where we can take it as a blockchain platform, where even the development and what we're choosing to build, that is open source, and then the community that I don't want to really go too much into that because a lot of thinking has to go into that in order to do it the right way, because a lot of many platforms have been created, but if they don't have strong communities around not only the execution of what the platform is doing, but also strong communities around the technical developments of what the platform is doing. So that's like a community of developers and a community of users, right? If there isn't a strong community around the platform from the beginning, that is what will drive. That's what drives decentralized ownership of the platform. And when blockchain came onto the scene, a lot of people have tried to do that. The mistake that has been made is, you kind of think of a protocol and you say, this is the rules and this is how we're going to do it. But we believe that if you're truly going to develop a protocol, meaning a set of rules on how the platform will be built and how the platform will be run, those rules need to be developed over time as the platform is being used, because you're taking in insights of how it's being used. I hope I'm not confusing people. Please give me feedback if that's the case. And so just to summarize, in a protocol that actually works, decentralized ownership that actually works needs to be co-created, not designed and implemented. And so because we are seeking to have co-creation from the beginning, that's the reason for the strategy of going slow and bringing in all of these collaborative actors from the beginning, instead of thinking about it as, you put capital, you execute, transactional in a sense. You bring capital, you execute, you create a product, someone buys it, and then flip. I hope. Please give me feedback if I'm confusing people.
No, that was great, and thank you for clarifying and going back and summarizing. I think that's a really interesting kind of process for a lot of the investor network members. That ownership question is something that comes up a lot, and so I think that the approach really behind how to implement that sort of thing in the long run is really what is unique about this the platform that you're building here.
Just to put a pin on it,
Sure.
The co-creation at the project level is one point of innovation. Co-creation at the platform level is a second point of innovation. Both of those are in our vision. Co-creation at the project level is what can be done immediately and is the first order. Co-creation at the platform level would be the second order, and that comes with also just the advancement of both come with the advancement of the technology. But that's the exciting thing about being at this nexus point of an emerging technology and an impact, is that we can innovate at both levels.
Great. Thank you, Chi. And I want to give an opportunity to say that we're a little bit over time, and folks should feel free to hop off. However, we do have some questions coming in, so if the speakers are okay answering those over time, so to speak, we can get to those and then hop off in a few minutes. We received a question over chat around the growth path again, and whether it's focused on particular sectors or projects that align with Sela. So are there any specific issue areas or projects? I know you're working on the Niger Delta cleanup right now. What other sectors, in infrastructure otherwise, are you interested in expanding to?
Yeah, so it always goes back to first principles for us, and how do you change systemically a community? And with the Niger Delta, we've got an environmental disaster, but we've also, I always go back to just that one community, because I believe that the level that it can be replicated elsewhere. And in Niger Delta, we started in a negative environmental situation, which is what we're seeking to solve first, by bringing accountability. But then looking at infrastructure, looking at affordable housing, looking at renewable energy, and the reason why is that as you start to execute more of those projects, you're literally bringing power, bringing housing, building the physical capital needed to start really a sustainable community. And then by engaging the local community in building this, you now have truly sustainable development because you have environmental development, social development, and economic development. And so those two, affordable housing and affordable housing infrastructure, renewable energy, are what we're looking at, a type of project we're looking to execute. And then even more importantly, to speak about data and economic empowerment, you're then able to understand how the community members using those public goods or those physical goods, and that helps give a 360 view of the person and a better view and a better way of assessing their economic reputation, and ideally driving more capital specifically to that person, so then they can then develop their own. They want to create their own farm. If they want to create their own hydroponic fish farm, now you have a better view of that person and their community.
Great. That's the last of the questions that I have coming in over chat. I will unmute those who are on the phone to see if there are any questions that people would want to voice in. So doing so now. The background noise as an indicator that there are no more questions to be said in the air. So I guess that concludes this webinar. For those online, please feel free to reach out to either Chi, whose contact is up on the screen now. For those on the phone, it's Chi, C-H-I, at sela-labs.co, or to someone on the Transform Finance team. My email is Kurt, C-U-R-T, at transformfinance.org. And we'd be happy to continue the conversation outside of this webinar and direct you to some more resources. And we'll be sharing some more details along with the recording of this webinar. Sela has a demonstration video of the actual platform itself that we'll be sharing with you all. And there have also been a few links shared in the chat function in the webinar around the research that Joanna and Jess have been leading. So we'll be sure to make sure that the participants get that in the follow-up email. So with that, thank you so much for sticking on the line for this extra long Transform Finance Investor Network webinar. Thank you to our speakers for bringing the well-rounded and diverse perspectives that indicates the processes of Sela itself, and how having that co-learning and really community-driven process and thinking deeply about partnerships really leads to the potential for deep impact in the communities that need it the most. So with that, thank you very much, and we hope to see you next time.
And thank you, Kurt, for great facilitation and great preparation, and for bringing this excellent webinar to the Transform Finance Investor Network community. Really appreciate your effort with that.
Thank you, Andrea.
Thanks, everyone.